Chapter 1. In the bustling industrial heart of Guangdong, a toy factory rose from the ground with an eerie sense of inevitability. It was called the Labubu Factory. Named after the peculiar doll, it mass-produced a small figure with wide, glassy eyes and a mischievous grin that never seemed to fade. To outsiders, it was just another successful export, one of many products fueling China's booming manufacturing industry. But to the locals, the doll was unsettling. Some whispered that its face bore an uncanny resemblance to an old folk spirit known as Labubu, a grandmother spirit said to punish greed and dishonor. The Labubu Factory was supposed to bring prosperity to the area. It provided jobs, income, and recognition. Yet, even in its early days, stories of strange accidents began to spread. Workers spoke of machines that started on their own, of shadows that darted just out of sight, and of an odd, constant dripping sound in the storage rooms where no pipes ran. At first, these tales were brushed off as the natural paranoia of exhausted laborers, but when the first unexplained disappearance happened, people began to murmur that the old spirit had awoken. The wetlands, once home to forgotten shrines, had been drained to make way for the factory. In doing so, the company may have disturbed something ancient, something that had no intention of staying buried. The whispers grew louder as the months passed. The Labubu dolls sold worldwide, but inside Guangdong, they were kept at a distance. Children who played with them cried through the night. Adults avoided bringing them into their homes. And as the doll's popularity soared abroad, the curse within its birthplace began to tighten its grip. Chapter 2. The first disappearance was a man named Chen Wei, a quiet worker who had taken a night shift to earn extra pay for his family. He had been working at the Labubu factory for less than 6 months, yet already he looked older, his skin pale from the harsh fluorescent lights and his back bent from long hours at the conveyor belts. He wasn't the type to stir trouble or question authority. He came in, did his job, and left without complaint. But like many others, he heard the warnings whispered in the break rooms, unspoken rules that no one dared write down. Workers told each other never to let the machines run past midnight. They spoke in hushed voices about the way the factory seemed to change after the clock struck 12. The shadows deepened, the air grew damp, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the halls, even though no pipes lined the ceilings. Another rule was never to stare too long at the storage crates filled with unfinished dolls. The half-sewn faces, glassy eyes, and stitched mouths gave people the feeling they were being watched, and some swore the dolls shifted when no one was looking. Chen Wei knew these stories, but poverty leaves little room for superstition. With his wife at home and his young daughter needing school supplies, he could not afford to refuse the overtime shifts. On his last night at the factory, his colleagues recalled hearing him humming softly as he worked a lullaby his grandmother used to sing to him by the river when he was a boy. Hours later, his station was found abandoned. The machines around him were still running, gears turning and belts moving, but his tools lay neatly in place as if he had simply vanished mid-step. The only trace of him was a single Labubu doll propped on his chair. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, its painted smile stretched wider in the flickering light. At first, management insisted he had quit without notice. They said he had likely grown tired of the long hours and simply walked away. But his family rejected that story immediately. His wife said he had left home that night with a promise to return, carrying his lunchbox and a pack of cigarettes he never smoked. His daughter swore she saw him later that night, standing at the end of her bed. She described him as soaked, his clothes dripping river water onto the floorboards, his lips pale and trembling. In a cracked voice, he whispered just 4 words, "Don't play with the doll." Soon after Chen Wei's disappearance, others followed. Men and women who had worked the night shifts began vanishing. Some never returned from their posts. Others were last seen walking the factory halls alone, turning a corner and simply never coming out the other side. Panic grew when bodies began to appear under circumstances that no one could explain. One man was found crushed beneath a conveyor belt that had turned on by itself, though the power had been cut for the night. Another was discovered floating face down in a vat of dye, though no one saw him fall, and the liquid was far too shallow to drown in. Rumors began to spread faster than management could suppress them. The survivors started noticing unsettling details about the dolls themselves. At first, they were stuffed with ordinary cotton, soft and dry. But every so often, a worker would slice open a defective doll, only to find damp reeds inside, tangled with straw, slick with river water. These plants were not found anywhere near the factory grounds. They were plants that grew only along the riverbanks, the same river where an old shrine once stood, long ago buried when the wetlands were drained to build the factory. Whispers turned darker. Some workers claimed the dolls whispered back to them when left alone in storage rooms, faint murmurs in voices too small and too old to belong to children. Others said the dolls' glass eyes reflected light even in complete darkness. Tiny glimmers in rooms with no lamps. The managers tried desperately to maintain order. They dismissed every story, every sighting, every whisper as nonsense. Those who spoke out were punished, some even fired. Yet no punishment could silence the terror that spread through the workforce. Even in silence, the fear could be felt in the way workers avoided certain corners of the factory or how they refused to look at the rows of dolls when they passed them. And in their fear, they remembered the old tales, the stories of Labubu Po, the grandmother spirit of the river, who drowned children who wandered too close to her waters and cursed those who dared to desecrate her shrine. Her name had been nearly forgotten, spoken only in village stories told by grandparents. But now, in the factory that had taken her land, her presence was felt again. Even the name Labubu, once chosen for its catchy sound, began to change meaning. To the factory owners, it was nothing more than a brand, a name that rolled off the tongue, easy to market to children around the world. To the villagers, it became a distorted echo of the grandmother spirit's true name. Labubu was no longer a doll. It was a warning. They began to believe the company had not only disturbed her resting place, but had trapped her essence inside every doll they shipped abroad. By the end of that year, more than a dozen workers had disappeared without explanation. Families begged officials to shut the factory down, but their cries fell on deaf ears. The profits were too great, and the demand for Labubu dolls in foreign markets was rising. To admit that something supernatural was happening would risk scandal, reputation, and money. So, the officials turned their eyes away, claiming the disappearances were runaways, accidents, or drunken misfortunes. But the villagers knew better. They saw the fear in the eyes of the workers who returned from night shifts. They smelled the damp, moldy scent clinging to their clothes, the scent of river water and decay. They heard the whispers that grew louder with each passing month. The Labubu factory pressed on, its machines running day and night, its dolls shipped in crates across the globe. But within its walls, the whispers grew into something tangible. The building itself felt like a labyrinth of shadows, a place where every corner hid a secret, where every machine groaned not from gears and metal, but from something older, something alive. For those who lived in Guangdong, the factory was no longer a symbol of prosperity. It had become a haunted place, a monument to greed and ignorance, where an ancient spirit fed on the lives of the living. The curse of the Labubu factory had only just begun to tighten its grip. Chapter 3. As the factory's shadow lengthened, the curse began to seep beyond its walls. At first, it was subtle. Families of missing workers reported small disturbances inside their homes, a knock at the door in the middle of the night, only to find a Labubu doll waiting on the steps. Its grin stretched wider than they remembered. Others swore the dolls appeared on shelves and bedsides without anyone having brought them inside. Mothers hid them, fathers burned them, but somehow they always returned, their plastic eyes reflecting candlelight in ways that made even the bravest shudder. Children began to whisper of secret conversations. They claimed the dolls spoke to them after dark, soft voices urging them to leave their homes, to play near the riverbanks where the wetlands had once spread. Parents brushed it off as imagination, until one chilling night proved otherwise. Lin Hua, a mother of two, woke in the early hours of morning to an empty bed where her youngest son had been sleeping. Panic overtook her as she noticed the front door standing ajar, creaking against the frame with every gust of wind. When she looked closer, her heart sank. Muddy footprints trailed across the floor, leading out into the darkness. She screamed for her husband and neighbors, and together they searched frantically, their lanterns casting wild shadows along the river. At dawn, they found him. The boy stood waist-deep in the murky water, shivering but alive. In his hands he clutched a Labubu doll, soaked yet perfectly intact, its grin mocking the desperation around him. His eyes were blank, staring past his mother as if she weren't there at all. When they pulled him out, his skin was ice cold, his lips blue. He had no memory of how he had gotten there. All he repeated, in a voice that was not his own, was a single phrase, "She called me." The village itself grew restless in the following weeks. Animals refused to enter certain streets, dogs howled into the night without reason, and chickens pecked nervously at shadows. Streetlights flickered violently, plunging alleys into darkness before snapping back to life. The smell followed soon after, a damp, moldy odor that clung to the air, heavy and suffocating. It rolled out from the direction of the factory and drifted through the narrow lanes whenever the night shifts ran long, filling every nostril with the unmistakable scent of stagnant river water. Fear was no longer confined to the workers. The entire community felt it. It was during this uneasy time that Li Mei, a young journalist from Guangzhou, arrived. Curious, determined, and perhaps too naive, she had heard whispers of the disappearances and the so-called curse of the dolls. While other journalists dismissed the tale as rural superstition, Li Mei sensed there was more beneath the surface. She began her work by speaking with the villagers. The stories disturbed her. Families who burned dolls only to find them back in their homes, children who woke screaming about an old woman's voice, and laborers who swore the machines moved without power, their gears turning in complete silence. The accounts converged around a single theme. The dolls were not merely toys, they were vessels, and through them, the presence of something ancient reached into the world of the living. Determined to see the truth with her own eyes, Li Mei planned an unauthorized visit to the factory itself. One moonless night, with only a small camera and notebook in her bag, she slipped past the rusted gates and entered the labyrinth of halls. The silence was suffocating. The air inside was thick with condensation, the walls slick as though the factory itself breathed moisture. It made no sense outside, the weather was dry. Yet here, everything smelled of mildew and rot. She walked past rows of crates stacked to the ceiling, each filled with Labubu dolls. Their painted smiles glowed eerily under the failing fluorescent lights. As she passed, she swore their eyes followed her. In the assembly line rooms, half-finished dolls dangled limply, their cloth bodies swaying though there was no wind. But it was in a storage room where she found the worst of it. Hoping to gather evidence, she sliced open one of the dolls. Instead of cotton, she found clumps of blackened human hair, damp and knotted, bound together with what looked like fingernail clippings. Her stomach lurched, and she forced herself to take photographs, but the camera betrayed her. The images blurred, distorted, as if the lens itself refused to capture what she saw. Then came the sound. From somewhere deeper in the building, a voice rose faint, wavering, and old. It sang a lullaby, one Li Mei recognized from the villagers' stories. The song of Labubu Po, the grandmother spirit, who called children into the water and punished the greedy who defiled her resting place. The melody drifted down the hallway, soft but unmistakable, and with it came a chilling truth. The spirit was awake. Terrified, Li Mei fled. She stumbled out of the factory, clutching her camera, her notebook soaked with condensation. She published her findings days later, describing the hair, the nails, the eerie voice, but her story was quickly buried. Officials branded it as sensationalism, calling it disrespectful to the families and damaging to the reputation of Guangdong's industry. Her newspaper was threatened and her article erased, yet suppression could not erase whispers. Word of her discoveries spread through the village like wildfire. The people believed now, more than ever, that Labubu Po's curse had been sealed into every Labubu doll. From that moment, the haunting worsened. Families tried to burn the dolls, but the toys would return in the ashes, untouched by fire. Others buried them, only to find them later sitting by the front door, dirt still clinging to their stitched limbs. Nightmares took hold of the villagers. Men and women awoke choking, convinced they had been drowning. Children screamed of being dragged underwater by unseen hands, of hearing a grandmother's voice whisper their names in the dark. Some swore the voice called not only from the river, but from inside their very homes. Fear became unbearable. A number of residents fled, abandoning their houses and shops, leaving belongings behind in their haste to escape the unseen terror. But others, bound by poverty or disbelief, remained. Those who stayed sank deeper into despair, their lives unraveling under the weight of endless dread. The boundaries between the living and the dead began to blur. The factory no longer felt like a workplace. It had become a gateway, a wound in the earth through which something malignant seeped into the world. And with each crate of dolls shipped out of Guangdong to distant markets, the curse was carried farther. It spread silently, unseen, concealed behind painted smiles and glassy eyes. What began as whispers in a small town had grown into something much larger. The Labubu dolls were no longer just toys. They were harbingers, vessels of a spirit that had been disturbed, and no one could say where the curse would reach next. Chapter 4. By the second year of the factory's operation, the town was unraveling. Too many had vanished, too many families left grieving, and yet the Labubu dolls continued to roll off the assembly lines without pause. The factory's success abroad was undeniable. Shipments left every week, and children overseas clamored for the strange grinning figures. But in Guangdong, no one dared bring them home. The villagers avoided even touching the boxes that carried them out. The deaths and disappearances could no longer be explained away as accidents. Fathers had gone to work and never returned. Mothers had been swallowed by the factory's silence. Entire households were shattered. At night, the cries of grieving families echoed through the narrow streets, carrying with them the weight of despair. It became clear to the people that waiting for help from officials or factory owners was useless. They would do nothing. Profit had blinded them. If the town wanted peace, it would have to seize it with its own hands. So, a plan was formed in secret. By candlelight, in small rooms with the windows boarded shut, a group of workers and villagers gathered. They spoke of the old spirit, Labubu, and of the desecrated shrine buried beneath the factory grounds. The only solution, they believed, was to burn it all down, to reduce the cursed machines and the dolls to ash, to return the land to the river, and perhaps to appease the spirit they had awakened. Among those present was Li Mei, the journalist whose investigation had revealed the horror within. She knew better than most that the curse was real, and her resolve had only hardened. On the chosen night, clouds smothered the moon, leaving the sky black. The group moved quickly and silently, carrying torches and cans of fuel. Their faces were tense but determined, as if each step carried the weight of generations. They slipped past the gates and entered the hushed labyrinth of halls. For a brief moment, all was quiet, as though the factory itself were holding its breath. Then the torches were lit. Flames spread across crates of dolls, the fire hungrily consuming cloth and plastic. But the factory did not fall quietly. It fought back. Machines roared to life, gears grinding and belts snapping into motion even as flames licked their sides. Conveyor systems jerked forward, scattering half-finished dolls across the floor in a storm of painted smiles. The sprinklers activated, but instead of water, a foul black liquid poured down thick, reeking of rot and decay. It coated the workers, slicking their skin with the stench of death. Panic erupted. In the chaos, some swore they saw her, an old woman's shadow gliding through the smoke, her back bent, her long hair dripping as though she had risen straight from the river. Her lullaby filled the air, chilling and sweet, weaving through the roar of fire and machines. Others claimed the dolls themselves moved, twitching in the flames, their heads turning, their arms reaching as if they were alive. The fire raged for hours. Screams echoed from inside as men and women vanished into the smoke, swallowed by the factory's depths. When dawn finally came, the Labubu factory was reduced to a charred ruin. The survivors stumbled into the daylight, coughing and broken. Yet there was no celebration. The river nearby had turned black with ash, and on its banks, intact dolls had washed ashore. They sat among the reeds as though placed deliberately, their glass eyes gleaming in the morning sun, their stitched smiles stretched wider than ever. The site was abandoned. No one dared rebuild on that cursed land. The charred skeleton of the factory was left to rot, and the soil grew wild again. But peace did not return. Travelers passing through at night spoke of hearing machines whirring from the ruins, the faint grind of gears, though nothing remained to power them. Fishermen pulled in their nets only to find dolls tangled within, their cloth bodies dripping with river water, their faces staring blankly as though waiting to be claimed. Years passed, and the memory of the fire became a ghost story whispered in Guangdong. Yet the curse did not end with the flames. Rare Labubu dolls began to appear at flea markets and collector shops across China. They were sold as curiosities, relics from a defunct factory. Collectors marveled at their eerie grins and paid handsomely for them, unaware of the weight they carried. But misfortune followed those who brought them home. Illness struck suddenly. Accidents befell households. At night, whispers filled the corners of bedrooms, and shadows moved across walls when no one was there. The curse of the Labubu factory had not been destroyed. It had only been scattered, carried outward on the smiling faces of dolls that would never stop watching. And in Guangdong, the river still sang at night. A grandmother's lullaby drifted across the water, soft and cruel, promising that the debt of greed would never be repaid.